All right, if y'all want to make your way on in, I waited till 3:01 to start speaking. That way, nobody would accuse me of trying to start things on time. I'm a Bible college professor, so it's funny because I'm usually very up front. I'm always like, it's okay, everybody sit in. But then I usually go 2 minutes over. So every time they always point, they're like, you went 2 minutes over. And I was like, but you were 3 minutes late. So let's just call it even. But thank you, honestly, so much for not just today, but last weekend coming here. It's one of those things where I love going and speaking places, but it almost feels like it's a non-reciprocal relationship because I genuinely feel like I get more out of interacting with you all than what I feel like I give. So I really do want to say thank you for having me and even some of you just sharing your stories with me. I believe that stories are some of the most sacred things that we have. And whenever I receive them from other people where they share their story, I receive it as a gift. So thank you for those gifts of your stories. And we get to study a little more Revelation stuff, which is exciting. However, before we dive in, I do want to, I think it'll be seen as vain first, and then I'll explain it. And hopefully by the time I'm done explaining it, it won't be vain. Because it's a big fat picture of me. But this is actually a card that I think is floating around the room in some way, shape, or form. And what I'm doing is this. I actually grew up in a small church. And then I ministered in a small church. And we would always, and when I mean small, my first church I was a minister of, there were 8 of us. My now wife and I walked into the room and it was we are 1/4 of the congregation. It was very overwhelming. But then I was at a church of 60 for my first 5 years of ministry. And I always experienced going to a conference and then they would tell me about all kinds of stuff that we could get. But then I'd go back and I'm like, I didn't have a budget to buy anything. I spent all my budget at the small church going to the conference. So one of the things I committed is that if I ever had an opportunity, I would to give what I could to the church, I would give away 99% of what I could for free. And I do. The only thing, and you actually can't buy my book off my website. You click on the book and it sends you to Amazon. I don't sell anything on my website. But my website, which is on the card, there's actually 2 things about the card. But it's shanejwood.com. And at Ozark Christian College where I teach, they let me record every one of my lectures online and put them online for free. So I'm always wired up whenever I'm teaching at Ozark, and then I put them online. When I mean for free, I mean they're free. You go there, you can download the lectures, you can listen to them right online, and you never even have to tell me you were there. It's totally free. I also have the Scripture Study Community. This is, you go there and you do have to put your email in for that. So if the web address is at the bottom, Scripture Study Community. What it is I give away, every Monday, I put out a new 6 to 9 minute video of me sitting in my office with my Bible, wrestling through a text. And it's honestly, people are like, well, what's your strategy of the text? I'm literally whatever it is the Spirit had put on my heart that morning in my own quiet time is what I record. And so it's just me opening it up, and it's just a different way for me to be able to hang out with you all, even though I don't get to come to your actual physical space. So 2 of those things, the online lectures and the Scripture Study Community, but again, when I say the word free, I really mean the word free. You're going to pay me nothing if you do those. Sound good? Anyway, and if you don't, it's okay, because literally you're not taking any money away from me because it costs nothing. So it'll be up there whether you use it or not. Okay, let's dive into the book of Revelation. Let's kind of go over a little bit, though, what we went last week through. Last week, I laid out 3 principles. I'm listen, if we're going to study the book of Revelation, we need to have some principles just to kind of give us some parameters and ground rules. Principle number 1 was the principle of humility. And the principle of humility just simply said, listen, I don't have this all figured out. So let's do this together. We're going to disagree. And when we disagree, let's just do it with respect and tell me why so that you give me a chance to grow as much as you're engaging an opportunity to grow as well. Principle of humility, none of us have it all figured out. That's why God is so awesome. It's the reason why my kids they're kind of making fun of me because I just started some new, I don't even know if I've ever told anybody this outside of people from Ozark. I just started some new master's classes, like I'm taking them. And I already have a couple of master's degrees and a doctorate, but there's two reasons why. Number one, I'm taking them because I'm building a master's at Ozark right now, and I was like, I want to be able to see what a master's class looks like from a student's perspective. And having not been a student for like 10 years, I'm like, I need to sit back in the seat and just take classes again, because it's different. It's a practice of empathy. This is something we need to get better at in the church anyway. You can actually forget what it's like to be a non-Christian when you've been a Christian for 10 years. And sometimes it's good just to sit down and try to see the world through the eyes of somebody that's not you. And so that's one of them. The second one is I just can't help myself. Like, it's a whole nother area of study that I've not dove into much. It's reading a bunch of the church fathers. And I just told my kids, I said, here's the thing. We serve an infinite God, so don't be surprised whenever your study is infinite. It shouldn't shock you. We don't have this figured out. Anybody that looks at me is like, oh, I've got God figured out. I'm like, you terrify me. You're a frightening person. Because there's no way that a finite person can completely solve an infinite God. As a matter of fact, Rick actually he's a preacher of the Church of Christ down in Texas, and he has one of my favorite lines. He says, we all want a God that is so small we can understand everything he does, but so big that he can do anything that we ask. The problem is you can't have both. He's either so small you understand what he does, and then he can't actually accomplish what he needs to accomplish in you, or he is so big and vast that he can heal even the deepest parts of who you are, but you're probably not going to understand the mystery of God in its totality no matter how much you study it. And that is a gift. And that's the principle of humility. We don't have it all figured out. The principle of submission, though, says we are committed to the word transforming us and not the opposite. So we talked about highlighter theology, and if some of you are like, I don't know what you're talking about, you can listen to the video, and I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, okay? But the goal is the word to transform us instead of us forming the word into our image. And then came principle number 3, and this is the word I told you I would use 60 times over these 2 sessions. The principle of, do you remember? Context. Yes, exactly right. Context, context, context. And we looked at a couple of passages, but what we eventually did is we looked at the assumption that the book of Revelation is a chronological roadmap of the future. And what we found as we're going through the text is that the book of Revelation comes to the end of the world 7 times. The birth of Jesus happens in chapter 12. We're missing 1/4 of the roadmap because the 7 thunders are sealed up. And even once we get to chapter 16, verse 15, Jesus still says, I'm coming like a thief. And at a certain point, we just say, maybe it's not a chronological roadmap like I thought. Maybe it's wanting to do something else. And I suggested that something else was transforming the audience, was transforming you. And so we started to dive into more of the historical background. So notice what I'm actually giving you is tools. Whether you've realized it or not, you've received 2 very sharp tools from last week. Context and historical background. And what do I mean by historical background? Practicing empathy. Putting ourselves in the situation of the Christians that were actually being written. The book of Revelation was actually written to. Because those were real people at a real time in a real place going through real issues. And I said, if I had one word that I could use to summarize their situation, it would be the word conflict. These Christians were being crushed with conflict, tension between them and the Jewish community and them and the Roman Empire. And in this tension, in this conflict, God writes them a revelation. And by his grace, we get to overhear the conversation. Okay? So that was last week. We all remember this now? I know we've slept since then, so I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page, ready to go. Today we're going to get two more tools, and my goal is to give you those 2 tools and then to try to save 15 to 20 minutes, maybe 30, but that's probably a pipe dream, for some questions. That's my goal. If I can't get to the questions, I'm sorry, because sometimes I get lost in what we're talking about, and then I forget what time it is, and then the question time's over. That will not be my goal, but my goal will be to save some time for questions. But I want to get through these other 2 tools. The first tool looks like the word genre, but it's actually pronounced genre. So it's, makes you sound a little fancy. It's a French word. It means kind or type. And whenever you're beginning to study genre, it's important to remember this truth. If you ask the wrong questions, then you're gonna get an answer. It just won't even be the one that was supposed to be talked about to begin with. So then here comes the question. Well, then how do we know what are the right questions to ask? Enter genre. Genre is not just a kind or a type of writing. Genre is actually also containing the questions that make sense with what you're reading. Let me break this down. Let me give you an example. So let's say like you come across a, I think my battery's, nope. Got a little more juice. Say like you come across a newspaper headline, and the newspaper headline says, Tigers massacre Indians. What is it describing? What are some possibilities? Okay, maybe a baseball game. Okay, so whoever said baseball, what would it be then? Where do the Tigers play? So it would be Detroit Tigers beat the Cleveland Indians. Okay, but that's only if we're in the sports section of the newspaper, right? What else could it mean? Absolutely. Maybe what we're dealing with is, there's actually two ideas here. If we're in the local section, maybe it's a politically incorrect title for saying that tigers from a zoo got out and killed some Native Americans. Maybe that's at the local section. But if you're in the international section, then maybe it's people from the country of India, known as Indians, have actually got massacred by animals that were native to the land. The problem is if you don't know what section of the newspaper you're in, you have no idea how to interpret the newspaper headline, and frankly, you'll have no idea what questions make sense. Because if I'm in the sports section of the newspaper, the Detroit Tigers beat the Cleveland Indians really bad, one of the questions I'm asking is, what's the score? Well, what was the score? That would be a sick question to ask if it was in the local section. Tigers killing these Native Americans. You're like, what's the score? What do you mean, what's the score? Well, that makes sense if you're up here. But if I'm in the international section, my question is going to be something more along the lines of, was it any missionaries that I know? Because I have quite a few friends that are carrying the gospel over in India. But that would be a weird question for me to ask in the sports section. Is it any of the missionaries I know? I mean, maybe I know some people on sports teams, but the question doesn't exactly fit. But whenever we're down here in the local section, one of the questions I'm asking is, are they still loose? It's the local section of the newspaper. That's kind of a big deal because I want to know it's raining cats and dogs, but I don't want tigers to pop out. Like, that's terrifying. So the section of the newspaper doesn't just tell me how to interpret this. It also tells me what questions make sense. Because if I'm asking, what are the playoff implications, but I'm down here, it's weird. But if I ask how many people were killed and I'm in the sports section, that's weird. Now, nobody's dying in the sports game. It's talking about how bad a team was beat by another team. Genre helps govern what questions make sense. Because you can actually come to something and be asking a question maybe as offensive or as absurd as what's the score? You see the issue? So the question then becomes, well, how do I learn genres? Here's the awesome reality. You're already an expert on genres and you don't even know it. You function with genres all the time. Whether you know it or not, you are well-versed in genres. Let me give you an example. So I'm going to be leaving here in about an hour and a half, and I'm going to be driving home. I'll get my kids, and it's been a long day. I haven't checked my phone, and I haven't, and so maybe I'll check the text. But then I'm going, you know what? There's a bunch of football games on. I want to know what some of the scores were. Now, would it make sense for me to, on my satellite, go to HLC to learn the scores of the sports games? No. What about TLC? What about ESPN? You know what's interesting? I literally just threw out a bunch of random letters. Well, they're random unless you're in the genre of the satellite, right? I said HLC, TLC, ESPN, and you all knew ESPN was the right answer. Why? Because you know it makes absolutely no sense to go to TLC and say, well, what's the sports game score? What's going on? How did my football team do? And if you got frustrated at TLC for not being able to answer your question well, maybe the problem is you're on the wrong channel. See the issue? You're experts on this already. So you go to your mailbox, and you're flipping through some letters, and one of them says in huge print, 0% APR. Keep it or throw it away. Why? Why throw it away? Yeah, it's some sort of credit card, or somebody's trying to sell you something that you don't want. You know it even by looking at the envelopes. You function in genres all the time. Let's say like for some reason, I have no idea why, but let's just say like you're a country music fan, okay? Okay. I'm kidding, not really. Say like you're a country music fan and you download this new album and you're starting to listen to it, and all of a sudden the first song, it is this really loud screeching electric guitar and somebody screaming. Do you think that you got the right album or the wrong one? Why? Because that's not what country music is supposed to do, right? This is the reason why people got so upset at Taylor Swift when she very first came out. They're like, that's not country. And finally she's like, you got me. And she's no longer country. But there's genre rules. You are expecting, something about like a dying cat or a lost ex. Like there are certain things you're looking for, but especially instruments. A steel guitar, that makes sense in a country album. A good acoustic, that makes sense. A slamming electric guitar and a screaming guy? No. Even the music you listen to, you are functioning on genres, and the questions are governed by which genre you're in. So when it comes to the book of Revelation, we need to ask the question, what genres or genre, so it can be more than one, what are we dealing with? The answer with Revelation is there are three genres. Three genres that this book demonstrates, which helps governs our questions. Genre number one, $25 word, really not that difficult though once we explain it. The book of Revelation is the epistolary genre, which just means it's a letter. You see the epistles of Paul. The epistolary genre means it's a letter. How do we know? Well, we'll turn to Revelation chapter 1, verse 4. Revelation chapter 1, verse 4 says this, John, to the 7 churches in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you. Now that right there, for the first century church, that would be like me saying, Dear Larry. It's the same format. If I say, Dear Larry, you know I'm writing a letter to Larry because that's our genre in the 21st century Western world of how you start a letter. But in the first century, the way you start a letter is you say, who is the letter being written from? John, verse 4. To whom is it being written? To the 7 churches in the province of Asia. And then the Christian letters almost always have grace and peace to you. Almost always. As a matter of fact, there are 22 New Testament epistles. Only 2 of them don't have these elements up front. The rest of them all have grace and peace to you. This is the Christian way of saying, Dear Larry. It's the same way. Now, because we know this is the epistolary genre, then what questions start to come to mind? Well, one of the very first questions you're going to ask is, who is it being written to? It's a letter from someone to someone, right? It's from the Apostle John. And in verse 9, he says, he has been exiled to the island of Patmos because of his preaching of the word of God. This is the last living apostle. After him, the rest of them have all been, the rest of them have all been martyred. As a matter of fact, John is in an interesting state because in the book of Revelation, martyrs hold a really unique position of reverence. But John would never actually be martyred. According to church tradition, according to church history, they tried to martyr him multiple times, and like the arrows would break when they hit his skin. And like they would go to light him on fire, and even though it's being lit on fire, he's just not burning up. And you got to be John. John's going like, what do I got to do to actually go meet Jesus here? And the answer is one of the more terrifying things that, frankly, I even myself wasn't expecting to hear the Lord say about me. What God had eventually told John was, you have to live a long life that is faithful to me, and eventually your body will give out. Like, don't get me wrong. Hear me very clearly. I have deep respect for martyrs, deep respect for people that in the face of persecution will say, I will not deny Christ. I will die for him. But I will say this, I'm growing to deeply, deeply respect Christians that stay alive for 60, 70, 80 years, and they're just simply faithful until their body gives out. That is a testimony you should not overlook. And it's frankly one that in the churches, we need the sages of the faith to speak up more and tell their story. I have quite a few of my friends, one of them will even say, he's like, I got a lot more snow on my dome than you do. Like, it's true, Mark. But there is this plea I have for the senior sages whenever I say, hey, I need you to understand that as the younger generation, we need you to talk to us more. We need your wisdom. And I don't know if it's the messages, and I don't catch this sense here at Northside at all, but I've been to a lot of different churches, and there does seem to be this undercurrent at a lot of other churches that once you have gotten to a certain age, you can't contribute as much. That's just simply not true. Like, I'm sorry, but our senior saints, they don't have to be relegated to just door greeters. You have wisdom in both successes and failures that those of us that are trying to figure out what in the world is happening in this world and how to deal with pain and how to deal with teens and how to deal with children and how to deal with losses like miscarriages, and we need the senior saints to step up and vocalize what it is that God has done in their life, positive and negative, so that we know where our anchors of hope are. We have to. That's why we're the body of Christ. Everybody's at a different age stage that offers something very unique, not to be prioritized over the other, but the reality is that we all need each other. John, though, is the last living apostle, the only apostle that dies of old age. But he's on the island of Patmos, and the churches are thinking, this is it. And what happens whenever the last apostle dies? Does that just mean the church is stuck? What now? But the thing that's also happening is, so we need to know who is writing it. We also need to ask the question, who is it being written to? And that's what we looked at last week with the historical background. It is a group of Christians in Asia Minor that are experiencing great conflict. Now, what I don't want you to do is to picture, as a matter of fact, even in the book of Revelation, you don't find this. You don't find this mass killing of Christians in the book of Revelation. Matter of fact, in the book of Revelation, what you find is Christians have been killed in the past in mass, but it doesn't seem to be present. There's only one present killing in the book of Revelation, and it's in the city of Pergamum with a guy by the name of Antipas. But the tension is building. It's almost like in the book of Revelation, in the indeterminate past, there were a lot of killings, and it looks like here pretty soon there's going to be some more. And that's exactly what happens. At the end of the first century, about 30 years earlier under Nero, there was a lot of killings. But all of a sudden, it's the tension that's building that explodes in the middle of the second century that you see being played out in the book of Revelation. They are in a pressure cooker. And you have some Christians going, yeah, I'm good, I can't do this anymore. As a matter of fact, there's a guy by the name of Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman official writing in around 111, 112 in the region of Bithynia. And he even says, he goes, okay, I'm trying to figure out what's going on with this cancer known as Christians. He's like, so I'm up here and I'm interrogating people. He starts torturing some deaconesses in order to figure out what it is that they exactly believed. He goes, I just found this silly superstition, which I think he's referring to the resurrection there. But then he says this, he goes, now I did interrogate some people that said they were Christians, but they stopped being Christians about 20 to 25 years earlier. And I remember reading that, and it's in his Epistle 96.1. And I remember reading it going, 20, 25 years. That would have been when Revelation was written. They're in a pressure cooker. The intensity is building, and some of them are saying, I can't do this anymore. And some of them are cracking. Some of them are losing their families. Some of them are losing their businesses. And the tension and the conflict is building to a boiling point that finally, a word from the Lord comes to speak to their situation. So let's make sure that whenever we see the epistolary genre, that we don't come to the book of Revelation and say, okay, now what's the score? Are there playoff implications? You see the issue? There's another genre. You get it in verse 3 of the book of Revelation. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. The book of Revelation is also the prophetic genre. Now, we did talk about this a little bit last week. Is that correct? Didn't I talk about the definition of the word prophecy in the Bible? You guys remember this? I'll do it really short for those of you that maybe weren't there or have slept since then. When you look up the word prophecy, prophesying to prophesy in the Bible, you find it in the context of a prediction 17% of the time. But 83% of the time, prophecy has a bigger goal than a prediction. I mean, whether you're looking at Daniel, or whether you're looking at Ezekiel or Jeremiah, like all prophets came to prosecute and persuade a rebellious people. That's why that's the job of a prophet. Even whenever you're talking about Elijah, which we talked about him last week. What was chapter 17 and 18 of Elijah was him confronting King Ahab, who was evil, Baal-worshiping king of Israel. Remember I said last week in the sermon, I'm like, that sentence should make no sense. It's ridiculous. And in this rebellion, God raises up Elijah to come and confront the rebellion. Every prophecy is demanding a response from the people. So whenever it comes to the prophecy, and I think I also said this, every prophecy reveals three things. Who God is, didn't I say this? What God desires and what he demands of his people. These are the three questions, whenever you see prophetic genre, that you would immediately be asking, okay, who is God? What is the clarification of God that is necessary in order for us to see him more clearly? The second question you'd be asking in prophetic genre is, what does he desire? What is the goal here? And the third one is, and what does he demand from us? So now all of a sudden we're starting to gather some questions. Are you seeing this? So when we're in the epistolary genre, you're asking, who is writing it? To whom is it written? What is happening? Then when you get to the prophetic genre, you say, what rebellion is present? What does God desire? What does he demand? Who is God revealing himself to be? Now we're going to get to the big one. Now, trust me, I know some of you are like, this is so boring. You have to put these stones into place. Otherwise, you will not be able to walk across the pond, I promise. You have to. There's sometimes I even just look at my students, and it'll be a couple weeks at a time, and I'll say, listen, I know this stuff over the next couple of weeks isn't necessarily the most invigorating. If you don't understand this, then once we get to the fruit, it just simply won't taste good. It just won't. You have to just sometimes just say, I'm going to listen, I'm going to figure this out, because without it, I can't even build the house, okay? Is that enough metaphors? I think I threw like 10 of them at you right there. That's a good segue, because the next one is apocalyptic genre. Yeah, spell that one out. I actually, just because I'm a nerd, I had each of my kids when they were around the age of 3 or 4, one of their first words had to be apocalyptic. It's like, come on, you can say it. So apocalyptic. Let me give you a $25 definition, then I'm going to break it down, okay? Apocalyptic literature is a revelation. Okay, that's good. We can handle those two words. Of transcendent realities. Now, a revelation. So something is being revealed. And transcendent realities simply means the things beyond what we can see or comprehend. They are transcendent. They go beyond us. So it's a revelation of that which we cannot see or understand. Does that make sense? So a revelation of transcendent realities, often communicated by otherworldly beings, angels, elders, four living creatures. You see this in Revelation. So it is an unveiling of realities beyond what we can see or understand that's usually communicated by an otherworldly being, by an angel or by some sort of elder. And here's the big part of apocalyptic genre. With a great amount of symbolic language. It is dripping with symbols. Dripping. To comfort and exhort an oppressed people. Apocalyptic texts usually emerge inside of situations where people need comforting or exhorted, kind of like prophetic genre. Now notice what I'm saying. I'm saying apocalyptic literature. What am I assuming by saying that? I say apocalyptic texts. What am I assuming? That there's more than one. This is one of the things that's so interesting to me is sometimes people are like, man, I just don't get Revelation. It's not like anything I've ever read before. And my response is, that's true. When you're looking at the New Testament, there's very little apocalyptic literature. This is the only full book in the New Testament. That wasn't true for Jews of the first century, though. They had multiple apocalyptic texts. The whole half of the book of Daniel is an apocalyptic text. There's other books. Matter of fact, let me do this. Let me read to you the very beginning of Revelation 13. I'm going to read you the very beginning of Revelation 13, and I want you to pay attention to the imagery. And then I'm going to read another text from the first century, and I'm going to ask the question, sound familiar? Okay? Revelation 13. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its head, and on each of its head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of the lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. Okay, are you seeing all this imagery? This beast coming out of the sea, and it's described with his multiple heads and horns, and then it's even described the leopard and the bear. That's imagery from the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7. And it's given this authority and this power, and it uses the authority in chapter 13 to crush Christians. Now I'm going to read to you from a book called 2nd Esdras. 2nd Esdras. This is written at the same time as the book into the first century, but this is by Jews of the Roman Empire. Listen to this. On the second night, I had a dream, and behold, there came up from the sea an eagle that had 12 feathered wings and 3 heads. And I looked, and behold, he spread his wings over all the earth, and all the winds of heaven blew upon him, and the clouds were gathered about him. Okay, I'm just going to stop right there. Does that sound familiar? Do you see how some of that imagery is overlapping? Where does this beast come from in 2nd Esdras 11? From the sea, just like Daniel 7, just like Revelation 13. And one of the key things, as soon as the beast comes, what does it start describing? It starts describing how many feathers and how many heads. And then the next thing you know, it starts to talk about how it's sovereign over all of the earth. And this is what I'm trying to say. In the first century, whenever the Christians would have received revelation, they wouldn't have been going, whoa, is John on drugs? Like, what's happening? They were familiar with this type of writing. It would not have shocked them. It was normal. It'd be like one of us going in and sitting down in Star Wars, but maybe you had never heard of it before. It'd be startling if, in 100 years from now, if you never heard of it, or 2,000 years from now and never heard of it. But for us, it's like, oh yeah, George Lucas has been doing this for like 40 years. It's familiar. We're used to the pattern. It'd be almost like me saying, once upon a time, you're used to the pattern. It doesn't shock you. Because it is a familiar genre. Is this making sense? And when it comes to the apocalyptic texts, the key set of questions that you're asking is, what do the symbols point to? What are they trying to communicate? Where are these symbols located? Where did we even get them from? These are the questions that you're asking. Now notice what I'm doing. I've given us 3 buckets of questions with each of these genres, right? You know one of the things I've not said with each of the genres? When is the world going to end? None of these genres were ever meant to answer that question. That'd be like saying, who hit the grand slam? The Bible's going, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, that's just not the goal. Like, I understand why that question means something to you. But we also have to respect the fact that even though the question means something at us, it may not be the question that's being answered in the conversation you're overhearing. We have to allow our questions to be guided by the genres. Otherwise, we're making weird statements about stuff. So we are dealing with an epistolary text, a letter. We are dealing with a prophetic text, and we're dealing with an apocalyptic text. Okay? Now let's dig into my favorite thing, symbols. Symbols have power. You know what I mean? Why do this? Why do this? Talk to me. It's not a sermon. Why do this? First of all, they're against America. But why not just say it? Why not just say, I don't like you? Oh, because there was two things that were said there, and both of them are really good to hear. One was, that hurts more, and the other one was, that's offensive. Why? Because of this symbol. It's one of the things that modernity did, the modern, Enlightenment, when all these smart people 500 years ago started taking rationality and logic, and they started separating symbols as if the symbol just points to something. If the symbol merely pointed to something, then if you did this to the symbol, it wouldn't hurt. But the symbols carry a power, and they actually carry a part of that which they're pointing to in them. We know symbols have power. We engage it on multiple levels every single day. How do we know that symbols have power? Companies spend millions of dollars on logos because they know all they need is the logo to get you to buy their stuff. Symbols have power. Why is it that you think that God decided to make symbols like a baptism or the Lord's Supper at the very center of our worship service? Because the symbols have power to not just guide you, but to transform you, or to, at the very least, communicate something that you absolutely, absolutely loathe. So what I want to do is I want to throw a couple of pictures up here, and I want you just to describe what you see. Because every picture is a symbol. Every picture. This is a symbol. It stands for something beyond just itself. So right now, I want you just to describe, what do you see? Father and a daughter. What else? Love. What else? What do you see? You can describe anything abstract. Okay, so the little girl's like, what are you looking at me for? Flashing stuff in my face. What do you notice about maybe what they're wearing? Maybe getting ready for bed or having a bath or... Okay, and there's also writing up here. You see that? It says Cincinnati Bible College, and there's a 24. Anybody want to make a guess of what this is? No. Then I will reveal it to you. This is Short Hair Shane. That's me. Yeah. That's before this happened. You're welcome. The thing that's funny about this is, number one, that's actually my boy. He's just a rocker, okay? So that's why his hair's long. I've never been to Cincinnati Bible College. They just gave me a free shirt. So I'm like, so I used to wear it every time I would go to sleep. That would be the shirt I would sleep in. I have just got back after 21 days of traveling around the 7 cities of Revelation and Rome and Corinth, and I've been gone from my family for 21 days. And this is the first moment I'm holding my oldest son, at the time my only child. And it's that moment where, for me, it's just me sitting there. He did just have a bath. But the reason why I also know that's exactly what happened is because I got him this robe in Turkey. It's made out of Turkish cotton. And it actually, you pull the head up, and it's got a little tongue, like it looks like a little dog. But for me, that's more than just abstract love. It's that feeling I even get right now whenever my wife just flew away to Portland this morning, and we've had a rough week at the house because my son had emergency surgery on Tuesday. And it's just this, like, I just long to be home with my kids. I look at this and sure, it's pointing back to a moment, but it does something different in me. Something along the lines of that. but just in a totally different direction. So let me do another picture. And this time, because of this, you're going to have a little more context to engage the next picture. What do you see here? What do you see? Short hair Shane, because you saw it, you have a new context, right? The sideburns, thank you. I worked hard on those, thank you very much. Oh my, the 90s, what are they going to do to us? What else do you see? Okay, now it's you guys didn't just say a baby, you said a newborn. Why would you say that? Because it's swaddled and because it kind of does look like the blankets that you get at a hospital. As a matter of fact, you can't see it up there very well, but if you see the curtains, you can see those are hospital curtains. This means something to me. Yes, 3/11/2006. That's the day my daughter was born. My only daughter. She was my second child. This is the first time I'm holding my baby girl, who is now 13. So there's a part of it that even wells up in me. I'm like, wow, we've lived a lot of life in 13 years. Symbols have power because they actually transfer you from one place to another. They have power to communicate things that, frankly, words just cannot accomplish. And so instead of merely just saying, I love my daughter, we do things like give her a hug or give her a gift or just tear up whenever you look at a picture of whenever she was born. Symbols have power, and we are humans that are not satisfied with merely what we can see, taste, and touch. We are drawn to that which is beyond. I have a lot of people, though, at times, they'll ask this question to me. They'll say, Shane, do you read the book of Revelation literally or figuratively? To which I say, I don't understand your question. Because language doesn't work like that. Language never fits into these tiny, neat boxes. How many metaphors have I used since I've been standing up here? Yeah, Lord help me. That's out of control. And yet, would any of you say that I was speaking only figuratively or only literally? As a matter of fact, I even ask, I say, what do you think the word literal even means? It comes from the Latin word litera, which just means letter by letter. Typically, what we mean by literal is we mean on the surface. Okay, but even that is a little bit convenient of a definition. Because here, whenever I'm driving home, if the clouds clear up, I will experience a sunset. Did you hear my figurative language actually in there describing something literal? The sun's not setting, the earth is rotating. I'm experiencing earth rotation. It doesn't have the same luster. But you knew what I was talking about, right? No one in here thought that I was denying the earth was rotating, did you? When I said sunset? No. It's kind of like me standing up here going like, oh man, this guy's driving me crazy. I'm not arguing that we're actually in a vehicle going to a location called crazy. No, I'm saying that we do this in language all the time. And we move in and out of figurative and literal language so fluently because we know the context. And the New Testament's no different. Yes, they're using symbols all over the place, and it's not just in Revelation, it's all over the Bible. But it's not like they're going like, well, is he talking literal or figurative? What does that even mean? Whenever Jesus comes in chapter 5 as the slain lamb, are we really going to argue that Jesus of Nazareth was actually transformed into a four-legged piece of cattle? No. The slain lamb takes us back to a story of liberation, of the Passover, where it was the blood of the lamb that protected the people from the angel of death, looking to take some of what was theirs. And Christ led us out of an exodus of slavery and our sin. He is the slain lamb. There's a part of this wherever I say, man, in the literal figurative debate, how about this? Instead of literal figurative, let's just read it naturally. And if it wants to be a symbol, interpret it as a symbol. And if it doesn't, don't. But don't try to put an entire book or an entire Bible in one box. Language doesn't work that way. And frankly, we don't want it to. We don't want it to. Let the symbols breathe. Let me even just make this ridiculous statement. In the book of Revelation, every number, every color, every animal, every piece of furniture, every weather pattern is a symbol for something else. It's dripping with symbolism. So let's just take numbers for a second. Let's just talk about numbers. Now, people don't know this, so you don't tell anybody outside of this room. I'm giving you a secret about the Between Two Trees book. Don't tell anyone. The number 7 is very significant in the Jewish culture. It's a number of completion usually attached to the creation account. Where do we get that? Where is the very first place the number 7 appears in the entire Bible? Genesis 1. God created all things in actually 6 days. And then he gets to the 7th. Yeah, he rested. But it wasn't like God got to the 7th day and he was like, oh, I'm exhausted. Like, forget it. I mean, we did the duck-billed platypus at the end, so, I mean, we're obviously running out of ideas. Let's just call it a day. No, they believed that he created everything in 6, but he extended it to a 7. Why? Because, number 1, he knows us better than we know ourselves. And I'm talking to myself here. It's interesting. We talked about this morning wounds, and one of the things we didn't get to talk about in the sermon is each of us medicate our wounds in a different way. We all have wounds. But we medicate our wounds, and each of us in its own unique manner. The problem really becomes whenever the way you medicate your wound is socially acceptable. It's clear to see wounds if you're talking to somebody that, is an alcoholic or somebody that struggles with a drug. Because those are socially unacceptable ways of medicating pain. But I descended into workaholism. And the problem is that people pat you on the back for that. No, it's actually something that was breaking me. That instead of me working 60, 70, 80, 90-hour weeks, I needed somebody to come alongside and say, son, stop running. What are you running from? Why are you afraid of being present? You're hurting yourself, and you're hurting everybody around you. Instead, what happened? Well, they gave me a PhD, and they gave me a promotion. And so the very thing that was killing me became something that was affirmed. That's terrifying. It's like, some people are materialists, but if they have a bunch of money, we let it pass because, well, they have a bunch of money. Materialism can be just another way of medicating your pain, just like alcohol. We all medicate our pain in different ways, unique ways. The goal, though, is to actually stop the medication of the pain and press into it, knowing that there's an empty tomb on the other end. And God even understood our tendency to medicate ourselves with work, which is why he mandated a day of rest. He mandated it. He said, no, rest. Why? I know you better than you. I created you. You think you can violate the Sabbath and it won't hurt you? I had a mentor that I deeply respect. He looked at me once and he said, Shane, man, you get a lot of work done, but you violate the Sabbath. And he said, I'm just letting you know right now, if you keep doing that, God will just tack it on to the end. You'll just die young. He's like, you can't just keep going at this pace and thinking it's not going to affect you. He said, so if you want to be there for your kids and to watch them grow up and watch your grandkids, he goes, you might want to think about doing what God asked you to do in just Sabbath. Sabbath is actually a difficult thing for me to do because it takes a great amount of humility. As it says this, God will still accomplish his great and perfect work even if I do nothing for a day. The world doesn't stop. The mission doesn't halt. He still moves. It's the beautiful mystery of that he does not need me, but he delights to partner with me. But he doesn't need you. He can accomplish everything if you take a day or a week or even a month off. I'm in the middle of a sabbatical. Oh, gosh. For a whole semester, they're like, we just want you to, travel and speak and write and rest. total confession time. This is Shane being very honest. Let's see, last Sunday. Okay, I spoke here last Sunday, is that right? Okay, the week before that, I had like a 2-week sprint where I was in Wichita and Texas and Colorado. And honestly, right before that 2-week sprint, and literally I'm about ready to hit another 2-week sprint. Right before this one, though, my wife goes, so how's the sabbatical going so far? I was like, I'm going insane. I said, honestly, this is one of the hardest things I've ever done. I was like, I feel guilty if I rest. I feel guilty if I work. I'm like aimless. I don't know what to do. I was like, I actually am excited to go and sprint for 2 weeks because it'll feel more normal. And then I was like, which is a problem. It's like, now I got to go back to counseling and figure that out. Like, what's going on? But there's a part of this where we have our own addictions. But please be very careful of the ones that people pat you on the back for whenever you know deep down you're running from something with it. Amen. Do you hear my heart in that? God creates everything in 7 days. That seventh day is very important. And the Jews believe this. The number 7 then was a number of completion that is embedded into the very fabric of time. It's a cycle of 7. A cycle of 7. And it never ends. It's a symbol of completion, usually attached to the creative account. If you knew that I loved numerology, then you would know what was in the 7th chapter of my book, Between Two Trees. Because the 7th chapter of my book, Between Two Trees, is the cross, where Jesus cries out the same thing that God cried out on the 7th day. It is finished. And so the whole question of chapter 7 of the book is, what is finished? And my answer is, old creation. But numerology, I'm going, the 7th chapter is the end of old creation. Guess what the symbol or the number for resurrection for Christians was? 8, which is why chapter 8 of my book is all about the resurrection. They did this with numbers all the time. All the time. As a matter of fact, think about in the book of Revelation how many 7s you come across. Just start name, if you know any of them, just yell them out. 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 thunder, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. Whenever you get to look at Jesus in chapter 5, the Lamb comes and he has 7 horns on his head. It's a number of completion, usually attached to the creative act. They used it all the time. Let me give you another example. The number 12. The number 12 was a number of completion usually attached to God's people. Where do I get that? 12 tribes and? Do you think it's an accident that Jesus chose 12 disciples? Or do you think he was like, oh, I wanted 11, but Judas came along? Like, no, he chose 12 for a reason. It's a number of completion usually attached to God's people. This is why I find it very fascinating. It's not just John that does this. Gospel of Matthew. Let me just trace Matthew chapter 1 up through chapter 9. There's something interesting he's doing. He's actually paralleling the life of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus. He's paralleling it with the birth of the nation of Israel in the Exodus. So at the very beginning of the book of Exodus, you have the Pharaohs getting a little overwhelmed with the amount of Israelites that are populating, because they're supposed to be the slaves, but they're getting so many people that it could overthrow the empire. So he puts out an edict to kill all the children under the age of 2. That's how Exodus begins. What do you find in Matthew chapter 1 or chapter 2? You have an edict by King Herod to kill all of the children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem. It's paralleling. The next major event that happens in the book of Exodus is when after the plagues, then they go through the Red Sea. They pass through the water into the wilderness because the water passing is their salvation. Matthew chapter 3, what happens? Jesus passes through water in baptism, and guess where he immediately goes at the beginning of chapter 4? Into the wilderness. And then he is tested for 40 days in the wilderness. And how long were they wandering in the wilderness? 40 years. This is not an accident. As a matter of fact, every passage Jesus quotes in the wilderness, it comes from the wilderness wanderings in the nation of Israel. Every one of them. So then the next major thing that happens in the nation of Israel's life is they're wandering, and then they come to the base of Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, what do we receive? The Ten Commandments, or the law, right? Do you know what happens in Matthew chapter 5? The Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus gives the Christians the new law. Matthew chapters 5 through 7, he gives us this new Christian description of the law. You have heard it said, but I say to you, that's how it says. He's giving Torah. He's giving law. The next major event in the nation of Israel's history was the conquering of the Promised Land, where the 12 tribes entered the new land. Do you know what happens in chapters 8 and 9 of Matthew's gospel? There are 12 successive miracle accounts. 12. A number of completion usually attached to God's people. Do you see what he's doing? With numbers, he's actually showing that the story of Israel is coming to fruition in the true Israel, Jesus. For where Israel failed, Jesus succeeded. And he does this through numbers. John does this in his gospel. Oh man, John loves this. 7 times, Jesus says, I am the bread of life, the resurrection, the way, the truth, and life. 7 times, I am the something. He's saying something. It's a number of completion, usually attached to the creative account. Is this making sense? Guess what? We do this with numbers too. Let's not just think that it's only them, those crazy, fun Christians in the first century. No. We do this too. For example, have you ever been in a skyscraper and you get up to the elevator and you need to go to the 15th floor and you're looking at the numbers, and what do you notice on the elevator buttons? There's no 13? Like, listen, I don't know if I want to go up in an elevator if the architect can't count from 1 to 15 and forget a number. Like, that's a terrifying moment. No, what's the issue? 13, yeah, bad luck, superstition. This is why I say this. In the book of Revelation, we don't measure numbers. We weigh them. They have a weight to them, a symbolic weight. And the number 13 in our society weighs something different than the number 14. It just does. Or let me give you another example that just happened a couple weeks ago. 9/11. No, wait, y'all are, why do you agree with me that weighs something? Because of what? Why is 9/11 different? Because of the attacks on the World Trade Center. But you know what's fascinating? Is if you were in the year 2000, those numbers would not weigh something. It was only 2001, where they then gathered a new weight to them. And all I have to say is 9/11 in any setting, and almost all Americans will go, mm-hmm. No one will say, you forgot 10. Like, no one would say that. No, as a matter of fact, even if I could ask you right now, where were you? Each of you would be able to say, if you were alive. That's weird, teaching college age, and I'm like, you weren't alive in 9/11? All right, well, there's that. The numbers weigh something. I realize that this, in a negative way, I realize that this is true not just in America and not just in the Jewish culture, but all across the world. So I'm teaching Revelation in Russia. It was actually, I think I ended last session with Boris. You guys remember me talking about Boris? His experience at his church was not the best. So whenever we left that church, we went to a new church in Kostroma. And we were in Kostroma, I was like, man, this interpreter I had was amazing. Her name was Helen. I'm still Facebook friends with her. And so Helen was so amazing. I don't know if you've ever spoken in a place where you had to have an interpreter, but typically you have to speak like 1 or 2 sentences and then you have to stop. And then they interpret. And then you speak 1 or 2 sentences and then you stop and then they interpret. And it kind of messes with, I'm a talker. So it kind of messes with my flow. So I was like, so at the first church, I did that, and I kind of got into a rhythm. And then whenever I went to Kostroma, Helen looks at me, and she goes, now, hey, listen, whenever you're getting up there, you don't need to pause. Just talk. And I was like, okay. So I start talking. I do my 2 sentences. I stop. I look over. She stops. And I kind of looked at her, and I was like, and so I said 2 more sentences. And I noticed she's interpreting simultaneously. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. She did this the whole time. No matter how fast I talked, she was interpreting right with me. To the point where I was like, okay, I have to do something amazing for her. So I go to Alex, who's one of the other English speakers in the church. I said, Alex, we have to do something amazing for Helen. I've never experienced before. I said, can we get her a dozen roses? And he looked at me and he goes, why would you do that? I was like, because Helen, I just told you. He goes, but in Russia, if you want an even number of flowers sent to someone, it means you want them to die. And I was like, oh gosh. I was like, then 13 flowers, that'll be totally fine. Like, I didn't know that was what I was saying. Numbers weigh something. In every culture, we have these. And the Jewish culture is no different. And the book of Revelation is actually a genre that prides itself on symbolism. So don't be surprised when these numbers, every time you come across one, they are dripping with something, like the number 10. The number 10 is a number of completion usually attached to a time period of suffering through which God proves to be faithful. Some sort of trial or temptation or suffering that God proves to be faithful. And where do they get this? It goes all the way back to Daniel 1. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're taken to Babylon, and they're taken into the court of the wise people. But they have a specific diet that they're supposed to eat as a part of the Babylonian wise. But what's the problem for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Yes. Well, first of all, you have some of the meat is sacrificed to idols, but also they have a dietary law that's very clear of what they should and should not eat. And the type of meat that they're being asked to eat is completely against the Old Testament law. So Daniel goes to one of the people that's given the food, and he's like, listen, we can't eat this. The guy's like, you gotta eat this. And Daniel's like, we can't. And he's like, if you don't, they'll kill me. And Daniel says, all right, let me make you a deal. How about you let us eat our diet for 10 days, 10 days. And if after 10 days we are struggling, then we'll eat your diet. But if after 10 days we're good, then you let us keep our diet. The guy's like, all right, fine, that's fine. 10 days goes by, what happens? They're even more wise and more strong than the people that were on the Babylonian diet. 10 days of a trial, in exile, time period of suffering, through which God proves to be faithful. Where did they receive the 10 commandments? Where were they? In the wilderness, in a time period of trial or suffering. And yet God demonstrates that he's faithful even in that by giving them his law. That's one of the things, man, the law gets a bad rap. Like, I get what Paul says. I just don't think we understand what Paul says. Paul was not trashing on the law. He was actually looking at us saying, you do know the law was never meant to transform you, right? Like, that's what Paul was saying. He goes, you're asking the law to, it'd be basically like, let's look at the law and saying, what's the score? And get mad when it doesn't tell us. It's like in this equation of holiness, humanity plus the law equals holiness. You know what the broken part of the equation is? Humanity. You know what the law is? It's an articulation of the identity of God. It's who he is. He is not a liar. He is not coveting. That's one of the things I always found interesting is whenever Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, God is standing next to Adam while Adam has one after another of the animals going by as Adam looks for a suitable companion. A suitable companion? You have God standing right next to you. And God goes, no, this doesn't threaten me. It's okay. He's not threatened whenever we are hanging out. That's why I had some people tell me before, they're like, I don't know if I want to go to heaven. I was like, all right, talk to me. That sounds interesting, but what are you saying? They're like, well, I mean, first of all, I don't want to just sit there and sing all the time. I was like, okay, your definition of worship needs to broaden a bit. And then they were like, well, but also too, just like staring at God all the time. Like, I just don't know if I can do that. And then I asked them, I said, do you think God gets upset when you and I are hanging out and having a good time? You think that ticks him off? You think he's like, hey, quit paying attention to each other and look at me. You really think that's who he is? I said, listen, I'm a dad and I'm an imperfect one. And whenever my kids are getting along, I don't feel threatened. I'm like, thank God. It delights my heart. Oh man, the other day, this was one of those dad moments where I was like, I love that. So my son Zion had emergency appendectomy surgery. It was perforated, so we literally slept in the hospital all week. He came home yesterday, and I don't know how he's doing because my parents won't text me back right now. But I texted him right before I got up here. I was like, "How's my oldest? Is he alive still?" But it was whenever we were doing an exchange. My wife and I have literally had like a text relationship all week where it's like, okay, I got these 3 kids. Okay, we're gonna swap, and we tag team, and one sleeps and the other one goes. And at one point, we both were at the hospital with my daughter. My other kids were with my parents, and then my son Zion's in the bed. And my wife and I are trying to figure out what are the next steps, and we're kind of talking. And finally, my wife was like, "Hey, why don't we just step outside?" And as I'm walking out with my wife out of the room, I look back and I see my daughter is just sitting right next to my son as he's laying in the bed, and she just has her hand on his. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like kids love each other. Like, how cool is that? Like, I didn't have that depth of intimacy with my siblings growing up. And there's nothing that delights my heart more than to see my kids love each other. Do we honestly think that heaven, God's going to be upset if we're hanging out like this? Do you think he's going to be upset if we go out and we're running and exploring and creating and inventing new things in creation? Do you think he's going, excuse me, get back to singing to me? I had a professor once tell me, he said, if God wanted us to sing for eternity in heaven, he would have made us canaries. But he made us created in his image. And the very things that you long for, don't be shocked if it's the same things he longs for. But I long to explore, and I long to create, and I long to sit down, and I long to just be alone. And don't be surprised whenever you can literally say, that's called the image of God in you. He's not that tyrannical of a father. He delights. He delights whenever we interact with each other. And why it is we would accuse him of anything different, I don't know. Because he doesn't demonstrate that that's who he is throughout the text. Old or New Testament. I mean, what's the whole point of the 10 Commandments? It's to reveal him to us, and it's to say, please treat each other this way. That way you guys aren't killing each other. It's actually trying to get us to live in harmony, in unity, as the Trinity has lived for all of eternity. It's who he is. I just don't know if we know who he is enough to know how to act. You see why prophecy always begins there? It always begins with who is God. Because a lot of the times our missteps, our accusations, the ways we treat ourselves or each other, a lot of times it's a reflection of who we think God is. It's why, truthfully too, even the questions that we ask, the objections, even the different commands and the way that we hold them. Like sometimes I'm like, we're as evangelicals, well, at least from my upbringing, it was very conservative. I actually grew up in a non-instrumental Church of Christ, which every non-instrumental Church of Christ is different. So I am not remotely saying that what I'm about to describe is anything like any of y'all's Church of Christ if you went to one, okay? Because they all are totally different. They actually are priding themselves. They're independent churches of Christ, okay? Man, our church, though, it was like, nobody outside of us was saved, and most of the time we're not really sure if we are. Like, that's the way we pretty much lived. And I remember trying so hard. This was one of the times whenever, even as a kid, I remember thinking, burden is light? Okay, Jesus. Because I remember I got sat in the corner for saying the word gosh. I got sat in the corner for saying the word shoot, because these were cuss words. It's like, we're not only, well, no, I shouldn't say that. We work so hard to obey God that we even make up rules that he himself hasn't even made up. But what's crazy about it is, you making up those rules says something about who you think that God is. That's why I ask my kids. My kids will ask me this, I don't know if I can, I might tell that later. But I asked my kids, I was like, no, do you think that our God is a God that's looking for a loophole to kick you into hell? You think that's what he's trying to do? He's going like, oh man, if you slip up once, I'm going to kick you out so bad. No, I actually see him doing the opposite. Like, I'm sorry, but becoming flesh and dying on the cross is pretty much saying, I'm willing to break down any barrier to get to you. But man, it's crazy how our very commitments reveal who we think God is. And let me just tell you this. It also reveals where your wound is. There's a book called The Faith of the Fatherless. It's a really expensive book because it's super rare. It was written by a Christian psychologist about 30 to 40 years ago. And what he did was he took the top 100 atheists that were listed at the time, and he took about the top 20, and he just dove in using his psychology background. He dove into their backgrounds. And what he noticed was 90-something% of them had absent fathers or fathers that were totally gone. And so he eventually said, atheism is actually the faith of the fatherless, because if you are struggling with a connection with your earthly father, it won't be a hard jump for you just to reject the existence of a heavenly father. Don't be surprised when your wounds lead you to not just a logic, but to the questions and the conclusions. It's the reason why the quicker you can deal with the wounds, the quicker you can see God straight, and the quicker that he can transform you into his image instead of the opposite. Make sense? Let's look at, what do I want to do? Do I need to convince you that the Bible uses symbols? Do you need me to go through that anymore? Okay, because think of the word shepherd. That's a symbol. Think of the word father. That's a symbol. Think of the word king. That's a symbol. Think of the word I am the bread of life. It's a symbol. God's been communicating to us who he is and who we are, the body of Christ, the bride of Christ, through symbols throughout all the Bible. So why is it we get to Revelation and we're confused by symbols? I think there's a couple of reasons why we're confused, and I don't think you'll be surprised whenever I say it has something to do with our context. Yep, okay. Now let me ask this question. Where are we? We're going to want to zoom in on this one if possible. I don't know if it is, but I want you to answer the question, where are we? Where are we? Okay, somebody said it. Where are we? Pearly gates. I thought I heard somebody say that, right? Okay, so where are the pearly gates? Heaven. So we're in heaven, okay? Now there's this guy right here, little guy. I don't know if you can see him very well, but he has a little bubble over his head and it says, uh-oh. Can you see? Who is this guy? Colonel Sanders. Now, why is he saying uh-oh? Because there's chickens. He comes to the pearly gates and he's like, oh, no, you got to be kidding me. They like the birds up here. Now, what's fascinating is, so that is the caption, Colonel Sanders at the pearly gates. What's fascinating is whenever I showed this in Russia, they had no idea where we were. Because their culture doesn't symbolize heaven through pearly gates. Ours does. But we have the context and the KFC context. Now, what's interesting is they do have the KFC context. Outside of McDonald's, KFC there's more restaurants KFC in the world. The only one that outdoes it is McDonald's. Everywhere I've ever traveled in the world, you can always find a KFC. It's transcendent, apparently. It goes beyond what we can see and understand. The point is, though, if you don't have the context, you're not going to have a clue what this is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a barrage of symbols. Whenever you see the symbol, I just want you to yell it out. Okay? Sound good? That's the game? Here we go. You just did. That was good. I appreciated that. What is it? Money. Jewish. Okay, Star of David. You guys were on such a roll. You know what's interesting? First of all of these, not once was there a word. I didn't have to use words. Why? Well, because y'all knew all of those. But then I get here and I hear emojis. I mean, yes and no. It isn't. Let me tell you what it is. It's the symbol for the World Cup in 2006. If that's the World Cup, that's the trophy right there. It's not like I was hiding it from you. Some people are like, what's the World Cup? Now this is gonna astonish you. The World Cup is the tournament for the most popular sport in the entire world. Soccer. Football, yes. No, not football, soccer. Yes. Now, here's what's interesting. It's the most popular sport in the entire world, but what's the problem? It's not the most popular sport here, right? If you don't have the context, you're not going to know what it is. Like this one. What do you see here? What is this? Running? Any guesses? There's a lot of opinions. All right, I'll put you out of your misery. This is the symbol for the National Bridge Club of Egypt. Why didn't you know this? Because you don't live in Egypt. You don't have the context, right? When it comes to the book of Revelation and we're looking at symbols, you're going to come across symbols and you're just flat out going to be like, I don't know what this is a symbol of. So let me give you 3 ways to figure out what the symbols actually mean. 3 ways. Number 1, well, all of them are the same word, they're just capitalized differently. The first way to do it is context, but all the words lowercase. And what do I mean by all lowercase context? What I want you to do is whenever you come across a symbol and you don't know what it is, simply read the 4 verses before and the 4 verses after it. That's it. And sometimes whenever you do something as simple as that, you're like, oh, okay, I know what it is now. Let me give you an example from the book of Acts, because this one is the one that I found to be the most startling example of what I'm talking about. I'm going to read this out of context, and then you are going to interpret it out of context. So if you know the context, don't say it. We're going to interpret it together out of context, okay? Make sense? Chapter 7, verse 60, book of Acts. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, don't hold this sin against them. And when he said this, he fell asleep. So what is this? What's happening here? Out of context, what's happening here? Somebody's getting ready to go to bed. Maybe somebody did something to him earlier in the day, and they're down next to the bed, and they're praying. And they're like, Lord, don't hold it against him. I know he cut me off, but don't hold it against him. And then they go to sleep. Now, if I read just 4, 5, 6 verses before this, it definitely changes some of the symbolism, especially the word asleep. Because do you know what the context is of this verse? Do you know what's happening right here? The killing of Stephen. And Stephen has stood before the Sanhedrin. And he's actually marched through the Old Testament saying, do you see Jesus here? Do you see Jesus here? Do you see Jesus here? And he gets down to the Sanhedrin, and towards the end, he looks at me and says, my goodness, what does God have to do to get the people that claim to be committed to him to actually listen? It's like, you're like, he actually calls them donkeys. He says, you're stiff-necked. Have you ever been around a donkey? If they decide not to move, they just stiffen their neck and they don't move. He's like, you're just a bunch of donkeys. You're stiff-necked. Because God's telling you move, and you're like, no. And then things start to get a little rowdy. Verse 54. When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, what did they hear? Well, Stephen had just said, he called them stiff-necked in verse 51, and then he says that he sees, that he's proclaiming Jesus as the righteous one. It says, when the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. That is the only time in the entire Bible where Jesus is not sitting by the right hand of God. He's standing. Almost as if Jesus, and I will say this, if the king stands, what do you think all of heaven does? They stand. Something magnificent is about to happen. It's almost like Jesus is peering over the edge going, hold it, something big's about to occur. Look, Stephen says, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Almost verbatim what Jesus said in his own trial. Almost verbatim. At this, they covered their ears and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him. Every time I read that verse, I ask myself, Shane, how often do you do that? Somebody's telling you the truth about maybe you, something that you have been struggling with, but you don't want anybody to tell you you've been struggling with it. And they bring it up and you do one of these. Like I see my children do that on the playground. Like, la, 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 I can't hear you, I can't hear you, I can't hear you. But we do this too. We do this to God as well, especially when he doesn't meet our expectations. Do you know what happens when God doesn't meet our expectations? We kiss him on the cheek for 30 pieces of silver. Because that's what was happening with Judas. Judas expected Jesus to be a military victor, to come and to wipe Rome out. That's what the Messiah was supposed to be. And whenever Judas didn't think Jesus had the gumption to do it, he put Jesus and the soldiers of Rome on a collision course in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now he'll step up. Problem was, Judas's expectations for who Jesus was were just wrong. They just were wrong. I mean, even Peter's expectations of what Jesus was supposed to be, even in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter's like, oh, okay, grab my sword. And he cuts off the ear. And Jesus is like, what are you doing? Put your ear back on. Like, when God doesn't match our expectations, careful that you don't just put your hands over your ears, yell and scream. Because you might end up doing something as stupid as Judas and Peter. They literally cover their ears and yell at the top of their voices, and they rush at him. In verse 58, they dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. Oh, Luke is masterful. He foreshadows all the time. Because we haven't even seen Saul until this moment. He just drops it in there, and we'll pick him up in like 6 verses. Verse 59, while they were stoning him. Oh my gosh, this is so crazy. While they were stoning him. That is absurd. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, which if that's not a claim to deity, I don't know what is. Receive my spirit. Only God the Father was supposed to receive spirits according to the Jews. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Who does that sound like? Jesus. When did Jesus say something like that? When he was on the cross. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. What does that sound like? Jesus. Where was Jesus when he said something like this? He's hanging on the cross and he cries out, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. What in the world? I'm not going to tell the whole conversation because I need to protect Wayne's sermon for next week, but we were even reflecting on this today at the Panda Express, that this type of ridiculous love for the enemies is what makes Christianity different. This is ridiculous. It's as ridiculous as the challenge that, so I teach a class at Ozark called The Theological Foundations for Biblical Justice. Biblical justice, not just social justice issues, although I will say this, the gospel has always been social. It's not necessarily a social gospel, because that means something totally different now. But the gospel's always been social. It's always affected the world around it. So this idea that the gospel, it shouldn't be dealing with the political things. No. The political things have actually taken over Christian responsibilities. There's a difference. Like we are the ones. We are the ones that are, pure and false religion is the one that takes after orphans and widows. That's our job. We should be the foster care system. Like quit relying on the government to do the church's job. And that goes for a multitude of issues. Am I right? I mean, come on. But I digress. What was I even talking about? Darn it. This crazy, cool love that we forgive people. Jesus. Oh, yeah. No, actually, there is something there. Oh, yeah, no. I know what I was going to say, I think. No, it is, though. It's this crazy love that will actually... Oh, no. Theology of biblical justice. That's what I was talking about. We get to this brutal lecture about 8 weeks in whenever they can't drop the class without getting a failing grade. Then I give them the real challenge. Because these are all students that are coming there wanting to help fight, sex trafficking, which I'm even on the board of an institution called Black Box International that rescues young boys caught in sex trafficking. I'm pretty passionate about that. My story might have something to say about why I'm passionate about it. I'm talking to all these students that have all of these ideas of helping the impoverished and helping, the sex trafficked victims. And then I tell them this. I say, listen, if your ministry doesn't fight for the transformation of the victim and the victimizer, it is not biblical justice. That is not a popular thing to say anywhere. But what do I do with Jesus on the cross asking for the very people that victimize them for God to forgive them? What do I do whenever Stephen's doing the same thing as he's being stoned? This is a type of love that will make the world stop in their tracks. No one does that. And it is not possible to do it unless you believe in the resurrection. Unless you believe. I asked myself this a couple years ago. I said, Shane, if you really believe the resurrection was true, what would you not give up? Like, what do I have to cling on to? The resurrection's true. It doesn't matter what I give up. I still get everything. I was talking to somebody in the hallway, and I told him, I said, listen, I've been on this journey of trying to heal from my brokenness for only 6 years. I told a counselor everything in detail only 6 years ago for the very first time. No one had known for 25 years. I told my parents 3 years ago for the very first time. And the reason why I told them, I was like, this could be coming out in a book. I don't want you to read it. We need to talk. It's like 6 hours later tons of tears at a dinner table. But I told him, I said, there was a part in this last 6 years where I finally just looked at the weapon of hate that I had in my hand towards Joe. And I just said, man, I'm just tired of holding this. It's exhausting. And I said, I'm not saying I'm not going to try it again. I'm just saying I'm going to sit down and just try something different for a minute. And I just picked up the tool of grace. And all of a sudden I was like, what in the world? If I don't know what it's going to feel like this, then forget the hate tool. There's a freedom there. I even had a radio host whenever he was interviewing me for the book, and he was like, boy, he used this weird metaphor. He's like, boy, you put yourself out there, you're like the last clay shoot in the skeet. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I'm not even kidding. I was like, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. And he goes, well, what I mean is, you put this out there, you're going to have a lot of people gunning for you. And I said, it kind of shocked me. And I said, well, I'll be honest with you. The pain that I experienced by keeping it hidden was far worse than what they could do. If the resurrection's true, what would you not give up? Like, what would you not give up? Because truthfully, this is one of the things that I had to come to terms when I was helping some of my students go through prosecutions of their victimizers. And I told them, I said, listen, I'm not saying they need to be held accountable. We don't want them out there doing that to other people. But one of the things that really annoys me, and I talked to somebody yesterday, last week maybe, that's involved in prison ministry. One of the things that frustrates me about the churches is that the prisons were not meant to be the punishment. They were meant to be the rehab centers. But a lot of times people go into prisons and they come out worse than what they were. And I look and I say, where is the church? You do know in Matthew chapter 25, when he talks about taking care of those without clothes and those that are thirsty, he also puts in the stranger and the prisoner. Like, we are supposed to go where people are broken, that literally the world has said, you have no place in our society, and we say, we are here with you. And this goes for the unborn, and the people that have been born and been broken after they were born. This is me saying, church, man, please be pro-life all the way through a person's life. All the way through. Because guess what? You know what I found is that a lot of the times people that are about ready to move towards abortions, they're people that are incredibly broken and have been broken by broken people. And they literally are in a desperate mode. They're not actually choosing between good and evil. They're choosing between brokenness and more brokenness. How do I know this? Because my mom almost got an abortion from my older brother. And if you knew my mom's story, you would understand why it is that that was an option that seemed viable for her in the moment. Where should churches, you want to know where pro-life, the debate is really fought? I'll give you a hint. It's not in a voting booth. It's fought in crisis pregnancy centers. It's fought by learning the names of these single moms and realizing that they are choosing between brokenness and brokenness. It's learning the names of the people and stop just in broad swaths and generalizations, writing them all off as evil. The same evil that hurt them, that now is devouring them from the inside out, lived in my heart too before I met Christ. What am I preaching? I'm preaching Revelation chapter 2. When he looks at the church of Ephesus and he says, "You've forgotten your first love. Do you remember the heights from which you have fallen? Do you remember the mess that you were in when I found you? Why are you treating people as if they should be perfect whenever they don't even know me? Love them into moments of transformation. Love them into moments of transformation." And you talk about pro-life in such a way that a person considering an abortion or a person that has already had an abortion still feels the grace of Jesus. Otherwise, it's not biblical justice. It doesn't match Stephen. It doesn't match Jesus. This is also where I get a little bit, you're allowed to disagree with me and get an A, okay? I get a little bit fired up with the way the church in America is acting, especially over the last 15 years. I had to preach a sermon called Speak Against Culture. I was like, okay. Okay, leave it to the hippie to talk about against culture. And I told him, I said, here's my dominant thought. You're allowed to speak against the culture that you're willing to be crucified for. So many times we're like, well, Jesus talked rough to the Pharisees. Remember, it's the same Pharisees that when he was hanging on the cross, he prayed for God to forgive them. So yeah, if you're willing to be crucified on behalf of the donkey or the elephant, talk against them. But if you're looking to simply crucify someone, you're on the wrong side of this story. It's just, and Stephen looks a lot like Jesus. And this is one of the things I also teach my students. In the book of Revelation, who you worship, you become. In the book of Revelation, whenever you're worshiping the Holy Trinity, you start to look like the Holy Trinity and talk like the Holy Trinity and function like the Holy Trinity. But if you follow the unholy Trinity, you start to look like them. As a matter of fact, it is so blatantly obvious who you follow in the book of Revelation is as if it is emblazoned on your forehead and your hand. That may say something about what I think the mark of the beast actually is. It's a revelation of what you do. People should be able to look at your actions and say, wow, they're clearly a Christ follower. To the point where there's a little bit of a dissonance here where I'll have some people be like, man, the person down the street, they don't believe in Jesus, but man, they act better than most Christians that I know. I say, no, I know you meant that as a compliment for them, but it's actually an indictment on all Christians that you know. Because apparently, you can live this life without the Holy Spirit. Apparently, you don't even need the blood of Jesus to live a good life. Makes me stop and say, then what are we doing? What is it about our lives that are so unbelievably unparalleled that someone says, that has to be God? Has to be. There's no other way. The early church, this is what they talked about all the time. It's the complete transformation of a broken person. I tell my students this when we're going through the book of Acts. I say, we're going to be talking about a lot of miracles, but I'll be honest with you, miracles bore me. And they're like, what? I'm like, they do. I believe miracles still happen today. I do. I believe that people pray over people's legs that were broken and then they're no longer broken. I believe people pray over people with cancers and then they no longer have cancer. I have too many friends that are all across this country on the cutting edge of where the Spirit is moving in places like Iraq and Iran and Latin America and Africa. And the stuff that they tell me that is happening in their communities, I'm going, I'm not going to look at them and call them a liar. Like I'm sitting over here in America. Like, I'm not going to tell them they're a liar. No, miracles are happening. They just are. But I say, but they bore me. And here's why. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. That's a cool trick. Okay? And Lazarus still died again. You want to know what I find to be unbelievable? People that walk into the church and they're adulterers and they leave faithful spouses. People that come in and they are just liars and they leave truth tellers. People that come as an angry, broken, intemperate mess and they leave patient and kind and loving. Transformation of a person's character is way more laborious, takes way more time and way more energy than just making a leg straight. And the thing I love about that miracle is it lasts for all eternity. And it affects everyone around them. No, transformation into the hands and feet of Jesus. That's what Revelation is about. That's what the New Testament is about. And we have to make sure that that's what we are always about. Whether we are talking to each other, talking to people out there, or talking to the TV whenever CNN or Fox News is on. Like we're coming up on we're already in a tumultuous political climate. The church has to lead the way of showing how to disagree and still love. We have to lead the way. Somebody was even telling me today, they were like, well, I'm even excited about the vulnerability that's moving even in our society, with Me Too movements. And I was like, okay, I am too. But here's what concerns me, is that whenever people that don't know God grab something holy, don't be surprised if it turns into a weapon to hurt people. Like the movements of vulnerability are wonderful until you use your vulnerability to victimize someone else. No, biblical justice says this: the wound I was given stops with me because I am actually moving into the wounds of Christ. And I will not use my wound to continue to allow a victimizer to continue to victimize. But I will also not victimize the victimizer because I was their victim. It will stop with me. And that is a love that no one understands. That's a type of love that makes headlines in Scripture. That's Jesus. And the churches of Revelation kind of forgot that. And sometimes I wonder if we do too. When you come to assemble, literally, what did I do? I just preached a whole sermon by reading 4 verses before verse 60. That's all I did. But now all of a sudden, whenever I read this, when he had said this, he fell asleep. What does that mean? I love the metaphor of asleep for a Christian's death. Why? When you fall asleep, what do you expect? That it's not the end. That's not the end of the story. That whenever you close your eyes, you're expecting to open them up to a brand new dawn. A Christian's death is not a death. It's like falling asleep. And sleep is fascinating because sleep is a healing agent that's unbelievable. One of the number one things the doctors kept telling us this past week with Zion was make sure you get sleep. Why? When you go to sleep, you just wake up and you're more healed. There's a healing agent to sleep. But it's also like a wormhole. It's like you close your eyes and you open up and you're like, 8 hours went by? But I sit in a lecture and I can't get this 2 hours to be over. You see, it's unbelievable. Man, sleep, it's just like, or you hit the snooze and you close your eyes and it's going off again. You're like, it's been 20 minutes? Like, how is that possible? The same thing is true when the Christian closes their eyes, it's opening their eyes to Jesus. And it's a healing agent. Something has become different. Now, who would want to just take the surface level meaning of that? I'd much rather that be a symbol. And let the symbol sing. That's what I'm a big advocate of the book of Revelation. I'm just like, let the symbols breathe. Like, I'll even have some people that were like, well, you talk like Revelation's all symbols. Like, do you think there'll be literal streets of gold in heaven? And my response usually is, I'm usually more tender to this. I am getting tired, so I apologize if I start to not be as tender. Usually I say something along the lines of, I don't care. I just, and I'm like, let me explain what I mean. The most precious thing that we have, even in the first century, was gold. And all that the symbol is saying is this: that's only worth your feet in heaven. That's how awesome it's going to be. I don't care if there's actual gold there. What I actually would prefer is for it to supersede what the symbol could ever have captured anyway. I would prefer that. And I think deep down in our broken moments, we all would. If you read 4 verses before and 4 verses after, and you're going, still have no idea what the symbol is, then what you need to do is go to capital C context. And what I mean by that is this. You ask, how is the symbol used throughout the rest of the book of Revelation? And what you'll find is if you trace the symbol through Revelation, first of all, it's not hard to trace a symbol through Revelation. You don't have to read all 404 verses in order to trace a symbol. Let me give you a website. It's super handy, super helpful, totally free. blueletterbible.org. blueletterbible.org. Super easy, and you can actually do what's called a word study. You can type in whatever passage that you want. It'll pull it up, and it'll have every single word. You can even click into it and do a Greek word study on the word without even needing to know Greek. You can do this. But you can just see how many times that word is used or that symbol is used in the book of Revelation. And when you do, you start to see that the symbol is used and there's a consistency of what it means. Usually, not always, but usually the first time a symbol is used, it comes with the meaning that then it is used throughout the rest of the book. Let me give you an example. The symbol of key comes in Revelation chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse 1. And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. Now, this is right before the angel binds the dragon, and I don't know if we'll get into that. We only have like 17 minutes, so I need to be wise with my time. If I'm going to be wise with I almost thought like, well, I'll just throw a bomb out there then, and we'll just, yeah, I'll do that. That's fine, because I only have 17 minutes and I leave, so what are you going to do, run me out? It's actually because one of about 15 different reasons, but it's the key. The word for key is one of the reasons why I believe Satan is bound today. Some of you are like, have you looked around here? It's not bound. No. Bound doesn't mean eradicated. There is a difference. Bound means limited, constrained. As a matter of fact, it's one of those things where I was like, you do know that most of the New Testament was written whenever Paul was bound in chains. He wasn't able to travel, but he still had a ministry. He was still able to do some stuff, just not all stuff. So when we talk about Satan being bound, what we're not looking for is him being eradicated. We're looking for a time whenever he actually is limited. And honestly, this is the bomb. I'm going, and for me, I have to be convinced that the birth, life, death, resurrection, ascension, and outpouring of the Spirit didn't limit Satan at all. That's what I have to be convinced of to say that he's not bound. And I just don't see that. I see Satan flailing. I see him going, oh, this is not going to end well. Matter of fact, I'm literally quoting Revelation 12. It says that the accursor has been hurled down to the earth, and he knows that his time is short, so he's raging in fury. Yet he's raging in fury because he's bound. He knows, this is what's crazy. What is Satan's greatest weapon? Death. What's the problem now when he uses death against Christians? It's life. I'm going to kill you. Okay. You're going to usher me to Jesus? What are you really threatening me with? To take somebody's nuclear bomb and every time they use it, it hurts their particular territory, limits them at least, if not debilitates them. It's one of the reasons why I find it interesting that in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus uses this interesting metaphor whenever Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and Jesus is like, "That's awesome. Well done." He actually says, "Simon, son of Jonah, but you will no longer be called Simon, you will be called Peter, because your identity changes when you see Jesus clearly." You see that? But then he looks at him and he says, "And on this rock I will build my church." And then do you know what the next part of what he says is? "And the gates of Hades will not be able to overcome it." And this is one of the things I find fascinating. He used the word gates. And who do the gates belong to in that text? The kingdom of Satan. But gates is a defensive weapon. Gates is the last line of defense in a battle. Who is cowering behind the gates in Matthew 16? The kingdom of Satan. How do we look at Satan today? It's almost like a lot of times the church is the one cowering away from Satan, going like, "Oh gosh, I hope I don't." Believe it or not, the name of Jesus limits the dark one. It limits him. It binds him. It actually destroys him. But the word key. If you're looking at key in verse 1, you're going, "What is key? I don't know what the symbol means." Look at the way it's been used all the way throughout the entire book. The very first time the word key is used is in Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1, verses 17 through 18, which actually I think these two verses summarize the entire book of Revelation. And it's not a summary that typically people are looking for, but I think this is what Revelation is saying. Verse 17, "When I, John, saw him," Jesus, "I fell at his feet as though dead." That's a proper response to the crucified king, even if you've hung out with him for 3 years in the flesh. "When I saw Jesus, I fell at his feet as though dead. But then he reached out and placed his right hand on me." That's the gospel message right there. Did you catch that? We fall down as in our deadness, but God spans the gap and touches us. This is the gospel move. This is Christ becoming flesh. This is the cross of Christ. This is the Holy Spirit descending on us and in us. We fall down as though dead, but God spans the gap, reaches his right hand on me. And then listen to the first thing Jesus says. "Don't be afraid." I talk about this in Between Two Trees. I don't believe that fear is just an emotion. I believe fear's proper context is worship. It's why Satan tries to get us to fear him, because you fear the one that is beyond what you are able to comprehend. The one that has power over you, or the situation that has power over you, is what elicits fear. Satan tempts you to fear because he wants to be in a position that you're worshiping him. That's why it says that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. Whenever you fear God, it puts you in a position of worship of him. And the beautiful thing is the one that then you're fearing tells you 365 times in the Bible, "Don't be afraid." The one that deserves our fear is the one that tenderly looks at you and says, "And yet you don't have to be afraid." And then it says this, "I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades." What is the key a symbol of? If you had to guess, what would you say it was a symbol of? Think about your keys. Okay, so there's something to do with its unlocking, right? What if I did this? What if I walked on the front row and I said, "Hey, can I have my keys?" Why is that a weird moment? Why don't you have my keys? There is a power, there is an authority of shutting and opening that whoever has the keys apparently has the right to open and shut whatever the key is to. And it's weird that she doesn't have my keys. No, it's not, because it's my car. And she only has my keys if I give her my keys, right? It's kind of like, how many people have keys to my house? Whoever I gave keys to. It's my house. The keys is a symbol of authority. The ability to open and shut. The one that holds the keys is the one that is sovereign over. Now notice, Jesus holds the keys over death and Hades. But what happened? How did Jesus get this sovereignty, this authority? Look at how he identifies himself. I am the living one, verse 18. I once was dead. What is that a reference to? The cross. And now look, I'm alive forever and ever. What's that a reference to? The cross and the resurrection is where Jesus attains sovereignty, keys over death and Hades. Does this make sense? Every time you see keys 4 times, ooh, I forgot to tell you what the number 4 stood for. The number 4 is a number of completion usually attached to the earth. The 4 corners of the earth, the 4 winds of the earth. You see this in chapter 7. Or check this out. Every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. Remember the other day I was telling you, last week, I said, I'm doing something on my fingers and I won't tell you until next week. Well, how many did I count in chapter 6, verse 15? Do you remember how many people I counted? I counted 7. It is a number of completion, but it was attached to complete evil. That's what is another way of referencing the fact we're at the day of judgment. The numbers come in multiple ways, but every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, it's a number 4. And the word key is used 4 times. Believe it or not, that doesn't happen just once in the book of Revelation. The word lamb, arnion, is used 28 times, 4 times 7. The word Jesus is used 8 times. Come on. Come on. Do you see what he's doing? He's even embedded numerology into how many times he's using a word. Listen, if I can do this with chapter 7 and 8 of my book, trust me, the inspired writer of the Bible can do it. He's doing this all over the place. The word key, though, is used in Revelation chapter 1, verse 18. It's used in chapter 3, verse 7. It's used in 9, verse 1. And the last time it's used is in 20, verse 1. And every time the word keys is used, what is it referencing? The sovereignty of Christ over death and Hades that he achieved at the cross and the resurrection. The first time it's used tells me how to use the symbol every other time. Does that make sense? So if you come to a symbol and you're like, I don't know what it is, just read right before and right after. If you still don't know what it is, trace it through the whole book and pay special attention to the first time the symbol is used. But I promise you, you will still have some that you have gone through all of that and you're going, still don't know what it means. This is all capital letters context. This is the third way to figure out what the symbol means. If you've looked before and after throughout the whole book, still can't figure it out, look in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is one of the keys to unlock the symbols of the book of Revelation. Let me give you this statistic. By my count, there are over 516 allusions to the Old Testament in the 404 verses of the book of Revelation. That means there is over one reference to the Old Testament in every single verse. Over. Which should tell you this. You want to know why the book of Revelation is so confusing for so many people? We don't know our Old Testaments. I'll be honest with you, some of the symbols that people freak out about, like the 2 witnesses, like if you just knew Zechariah 4, it's not that difficult. We don't know Zechariah 4. Zechariah 4 tells us who the 2 branches are. It tells us. It's obvious. It's the anointed ones, the king and the priest. The problem is we don't even know our Old Testament, so we look at these locusts and we think, Apache helicopters, must be. We've not read Amos. We've not read Joel. These symbols are not that difficult. As a matter of fact, I do this in my class. Whenever I teach Revelation, they have a paper they have to write on it, a whole passage. And the first thing they have to do is they have to look up every single Old Testament parallel to every verse in their passage. And then I sit them down and I say, based on the Old Testament parallels, what do you think's happening here? And 9 times out of 10, they already have a good grasp of what's happening in the text. Exactly, because this is the beautiful thing. The Bible ends the way it begins because the book of Revelation is bringing together all that has been said. It's bringing it together, but it's bringing it together through the picture of Christ. This is why some of the images that we saw in the Old Testament at once, they maybe were not as clear, but now that we have Christ, we're able to look at them and say, well, that's what it was saying. Kind of like Psalm 22 that we looked at this morning. Where you get to verse 16, it's like they pierced his hands and his feet. And whenever David originally wrote that, people are like, okay. But after the cross, it's like, oh my goodness, they pierced his hands and his feet? Jesus is not just, this is one of the things that's fascinating. Jesus, the New Testament doesn't just need the Old Testament to understand what came before. The Old Testament needs the New Testament to shine the light into it of Christ so that some of the passages that we didn't understand, we now do. It moves both ways. It's not just that the Old Testament flows into the New. Actually, because of Christ, it completes the loop and the New Testament flows back into the Old. It's the reason why we need both of them. It's the reason why the early church didn't let Marcion, the heretic, win and wanting to kick the Old Testament out of the Bible. And it's the reason why Revelation was preserved. You know the story because you are becoming the story once you submit to Christ. These are your forefathers now: Moses, Abraham, Elijah. You are becoming the story that you commit to that Christ has fulfilled. And the book of Revelation doesn't just celebrate that. It uses that to minister to a people that are caught in conflict. It's the reason why they use the word Babylon, referencing Rome. And it's one of the reasons why whenever I've been wrestling with that, I'm going like, well, first of all, there's some similarities between Rome and Babylon. They both took God's people captive in a unique way by destroying the temple. Now, why call Rome Babylon? Because this isn't the first time we've seen an empire attack the people of God. It's happened multiple times, over and over and over. Satan's tools never change. It's just a new generation falls for him every generation. That's the same tools. The same lust that people struggle with in this room is the same lust that Adam and Eve were struggling with in the Garden of Eden. It's the same stuff. Matter of fact, it's one of the things I even point out to my students. I'm like, even the stuff we're struggling with in our society today in America, it's not new. Like even these questions of, homosexual marriage and stuff, I'm going like, I can't believe people are acting like this is new. You do know Nero married a 14-year-old boy that was castrated and turned into a woman. Like, we're still quite a few steps away from that. This isn't new. It's one of the reasons why I also think it's funny when people are like, oh, all of Paul's commands, those are outdated. We've evolved past those. I'm like, it was worse in Rome. You think we invented homosexuality? You think we invented cross-dressing? Transgenderism? You think those issues just emerged in the 21st century in the Western world? Then you've not even read Plato or Socrates. Because they were arguing in favor of homosexual monogamous marriages in the 3rd century BC. Like we're catching up to history. We're not creating new history. And guess what? The Word of God was present there healing people then and can do it now if we just allow Christ to complete the loop. If we just allow Christ to complete the loop of grace. If we just dive into all the texts that we've been given that have revealed God. Now, let me give you one more thing. I have 1 minute. I'm going to take 3. Okay? I appreciate it. One other final thing I want to caution you with when it comes to the book of Revelation, and this temptation is real. A lot of times when it comes to the book of Revelation, we focus on one little tree and we miss the whole forest. We focus on one symbol. I want to know what this one little symbol means. And we get so focused on it that I'm going, you've actually missed the whole point of that chapter, of that entire section, of the entire book. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. What do you see here? If we can zoom in on this, that'd be delightful. What do you see? Describe what you see. It's like it's a Rorschach test. Like, no, just what do you see? Looks like a plant. Anybody else want to make a guess? Crisco? Is that what you said? I believe you. Okay, there we go. Yes. Okay, it's in hand. Now, let me do this. Let me zoom out. I'm going to zoom out. Now, what do you see? How in the world you saw it a hand when it was over here? I'll never guess. Do you start to see the form of a hand? Now, let me zoom out one more time. What do you see? Arm. Do you want to get any more specific? Arm of a baby or a young child. Because you can see by the way in which the arm is, it's smaller. It even has different. Let me zoom out one more time. This is a picture of my baby girl when she was about 5 years old. But whenever you're all the way here, you're so zoomed in that you actually even miss the beauty of the moment. You're missing the whole forest because you're looking at one tree. When it comes to the book of Revelation and you get overwhelmed with one symbol, zoom out. Because actually you can be staring at a symbol and be so fixated on it that you begin to define it for the complete opposite of what it is intending to be and do. Because we need to zoom out one more time. We're trying to take a family picture. And this little turd won't scoot over. You can see my face. I'm going, Paige. And my wife's going, why aren't you coming over here? Over here, oh, she looks so innocent and cute and wonderful. The reality is she's being a little turd. We do this with symbols and Revelation all the time. We get so focused on them. There's actually a chapter, and I don't have time to go into it, in Daniel chapter 9, where people in verses 24 through 27, they describe it. They say, that's the Antichrist. And I'm going, oh, you've zoomed in so far that if you zoomed out, it's actually Christ that it's talking about. That's kind of a big mistake. That's a big shift. But we do this with symbols all the time. We become so obsessed with what is the mark of the beast that you actually fail to hear the call for the Christians to lay down their lives on behalf of even their enemies today. You miss the call for us to become like Christ because we get so focused on, but is Satan bound? Is he bound? This is what I know. There is a lion that is prowling, looking to devour you. What he's hoping is that you ignore him. Don't. Instead, fight him with the only weapons that work against someone that you cannot see, that you cannot taste or touch. And what are those weapons? Grace, forgiveness, or exposing your wounds. All right, I'm going to pray. I'm going to hand it over to Wayne, and then he'll tell us what to do. Lord Jesus, thank you so much. Lord, for giving us your word, but for being the very word that you have given us. And Father, I pray that Northside will be like John in chapter 10, that they will eat the word. And that, Father, as they consume your word, they will become the very message itself. The hands and feet of Jesus reaching out to a broken world that is simply looking for a scandalous love that will shock them, Lord, into moments of transformation. I pray a blessing over this church and ask your Spirit, Father, to break open their hearts and to continue to give them the courage to heal others by the power of your Spirit that raised you from the dead, that longs to raise us to life. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.